The day you asked about the money or the behavior or the pattern nobody else would name out loud was the day you became a problem. Not a liar, not actually wrong. Just a problem. And somehow years later, you're still wondering if they were right. You noticed something, it started quietly, maybe a budget meeting that was suddenly for leadership only. Maybe the way every honest question got redirected into a prayer request before it could breathe. Maybe the third person in a year who simply stopped showing up on Sundays and nobody ever explained why. Your spiritual discernment fired a warning. You can't even fully explain how you knew, you just knew something wasn't right, so you asked. And the thing that happened next, that's the part nobody talks about. They didn't answer the question, they answered you. Suddenly you had a spirit of division. You were not in a submitted posture. You lacked the spiritual maturity to understand what God was doing in this house. The concern you raised dissolved into silence and you became the concern. If any part of that landed somewhere in your chest just now, stay with me. Because what I'm about to share isn't just going to explain what happened to you inside that spiritual environment. It's going to give you language for something you've been trying to articulate for a long time. And by the end of this, you'll have a concrete framework for trusting your spiritual discernment again after years of being told that your gut was the enemy. That's a promise, don't leave before we get there. Here's what organizational psychology has documented for decades, but rarely translates into the language of faith. A healthy system, any healthy system, can tolerate scrutiny, not comfortably, not without friction, but fundamentally it can absorb a hard question without having to destroy the person asking it. A sick system cannot. And here's the biology behind that truth. In medicine, there's a condition called autoimmune disease. Your immune system, the very mechanism designed to protect you, turns against your own tissue. Lupus, rheumatoid arthritis. The body can no longer distinguish between threat and health, so it attacks what's healthy with everything it has. And the healthy tissue suffers not because it's dangerous, but because a diseased system has lost the ability to recognize what it should be protecting. What happened to you inside that church, inside that ministry, inside that spiritual environment was not a healthy community protecting itself from a divisive member. It was an autoimmune attack. You were the healthy tissue. Sick systems don't know they're sick. That's the nature of the disease. Every high-control group, every organization that has quietly drifted from serving its people into protecting its own image develops the same response when someone begins asking the right questions. It doesn't experience accountability as accountability. It experiences it as existential threat. And so the system does what diseased bodies do. It tries to expel the healthy cell. Not through logic, because logic would require engaging with what you actually observed. Not through evidence, because there is no evidence that you were wrong. The expulsion happens through identity. Through labeling, you become rebellious, contentious, operating in a spirit of division, not safe to be around. The signs of toxic church leadership always follow the same pattern. The attack is never about the content of the concern. It's always about the character of the person raising it. And here's the part that quietly devastates people long after they've left. The people who saw the same things you saw often didn't come to your defense, not because they didn't believe you, but because proximity to the infected member started to feel like its own form of risk. They stayed quiet to stay safe. That silence wasn't just painful. That silence was the signature of the disease. The prophet Jeremiah saw the corruption inside the religious system of his time and named it clearly, publicly, at personal cost. He was thrown into a cistern by the very religious leadership responsible for the people's welfare, not because he was wrong, because he was right and they couldn't afford for him to be heard. The Apostle Paul, writing to the Galatians, asked a question that still echoes through every century of church history. Have I become your enemy by telling you the truth? The watchman's problem has never been the message. It has always been that the message was received. I want you to stop for a moment. The word divisive, every single time it has been used to silence a whistleblower inside a religious or spiritual context, has served one precise function. It relocates the problem. The question stops being, is what they raised actually true, and becomes, why are they being so difficult? Engage the content of the concern and you might have to change something. Make the messenger the message and the message disappears. Here's something that should sit uncomfortably in your mind. That label, divisive, has never once in the history of institutional power been applied to someone who wasn't threatening something that institution needed to protect. Never. The label appears where someone powerful needs the truth to stop moving. So the question that deserves to be living quietly inside you isn't, was I too much? It's, what were they protecting? But now we arrive at the deepest layer of damage, and this is the one that healing from spiritual abuse tends to overlook. What they did to your questions was one injury. What they did to your instincts is something else entirely. Years of being told that the discomfort you felt was your flesh. Years of being handed a theological framework that reframed your gut response to the financial opacity, to the pattern of behavior, to the culture of silencing as evidence of your own spiritual immaturity. Years of learning to override your perception the moment it became inconvenient to the group. This is spiritual gaslighting in its most precise form, and the damage it creates is a specific kind. It teaches you to distrust the very mechanism God placed inside you to navigate unsafe environments. Cognitive dissonance in religion is real, and it's deliberately manufactured in unhealthy spiritual systems. You were taught that the dissonance you felt was your problem, when in reality, the dissonance was information. You stopped trusting yourself because they made you afraid of your own spiritual radar. The loneliness of that particular wound is unlike almost anything else. You're not just hurt, you're confused because the system that was supposed to protect you spiritually became the instrument of harm. The language, the authority, the name of God Himself borrowed and aimed at you. If you're sitting somewhere in the emotional recovery from that, hear this before we go further. You were not crazy, you were not rebellious, you were not spiritually dangerous. You were early. And being early, seeing clearly before everyone else is ready to see, is one of the loneliest positions in any system. So here is what I call the truth seeker's blueprint. Not steps, because healing doesn't move in straight lines. 3 shifts, 3 fundamental reorientations that begin to restore what was taken. The first shift, separate the label from the ledger. What did you actually observe? Not what they told you were seeing. What did you see? Concrete things, the unexplained financial decisions, the behavior that contradicted the message from the pulpit, the pattern of people leaving quietly without any public acknowledgement. The label they gave you doesn't alter the ledger. Truth doesn't require the approval of the people it inconveniences, it only requires that it's true. The second shift, separate the system's verdict from God's verdict. These are not the same thing. A spiritually abusive church using God's name to silence you does not mean God was the one speaking. Every prophet in Scripture who told a dangerous truth discovered that the institution surrounding them had already claimed divine authority for the opposition. The system's judgment of you was a symptom of the system's disease, not a revelation from the Father. The third shift, treat your discernment as data. Not as the flesh, not as pride or rebellion. Data, something you observed, processed, and arrived at, something that deserves to be taken seriously rather than immediately spiritualized into silence. Your spiritual discernment was not broken. It was functioning exactly as it was designed to function. The problem was never your radar. The problem was that the system needed your radar to be wrong. You are not damaged goods from a toxic church experience. You are calibrated. You are someone who exercised spiritual discernment under enormous social pressure and paid the cost for it. The fact that you're still asking questions, still wrestling with what authentic faith looks like outside of an institution that failed you, that's not evidence of spiritual collapse. That is evidence of spiritual integrity. The watchmen in Scripture were never the ones who fit comfortably inside the walls. They stood on top of them, looking outward while everyone else looked inward. They were lonely, they were often rejected, and they were right. But I want to leave you with one question as you carry this forward. Rebuilding trust in your spiritual discernment is one thing. Rebuilding trust in God after His name was borrowed to silence you is something entirely different. Because the deepest question isn't whether your gut was right. It's whether you can still believe that God was with you even when His people weren't. That conversation isn't finished. But it starts with knowing this: you weren't the problem, you were the witness. And witnesses matter.